what I asked every one of us to do is pick one quote from the Denktagebuch to put up there so that we could actually read the Denktagebuch together in some sense. These are all our own translations, so if they're wrong, you can yell at us. I'll read it in English, I guess, so that we can follow along. So this, to me, is one of the really. It's a quote that's really redefined my understanding of Arendt in many ways. The solidarity of reconciliation is first not the foundation of reconciliation, as the solidarity of being guilty is the foundation of forgiveness, but the product. Reconciliation presupposes acting men and men who do wrong, but not men who are poisoned, taken over as a burden caused by another. Guilt, that is a psychological fact, does not come to be, but rather the actual happening wrong comes to be. One resolves oneself to be co-responsible, but under no circumstances co-guilty. The key to this, and what drives my reading in this essay, is this idea of solidarity, the solidarity of reconciliation. And what needs to be understood, or what I think needs to be understood, is that Arendt develops this idea of the solidarity of reconciliation against what she calls the idea of Christian solidarity. And Christian solidarity encompasses both forgiveness and revenge. We have a Christian solidarity of forgiveness is based on the idea that we are all sinners, the original sin, and thus we all could have done this great evil, whatever it was, and therefore there's a solidarity of nature as sinners. And the Christian solidarity of revenge is that if you can do a right to break the law and do evil, I have the right to break the law and do evil. We're all equal. And it's this fundamental Christian solidarity that she says is apolitical because it does not allow for judgment. There's no pathos of distance since we're all equal. And the reason reconciliation is so important in my understanding of Arendt, again, I'm not making the argument that you have to write about reconciliation or write about Arendt. I don't think that's the case at all. I just think it helps understand things, right? And if you look at the essay, what I do is I say there's 9 theses about reconciliation that I find in her work, and the essay's broken up into 9 parts, and I go through all these theses, and I say some of them are mutually contradictory. This is not a consistent theory, right? And I'm not making the argument it is. But reconciliation is a kind of solidarity against Christian solidarity, and one that has the great virtue of that it allows for judgment, whereas Christian solidarity does not. The basic idea of reconciliation is, as she says in that first sentence, the solidarity of reconciliation is not the foundation of reconciliation, but the product. And this is, to me, the line that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Reconciliation is the judgment that leads to solidarity. That means that politics, a polis, a common world, is based upon reconciliation. It's based on and so what is reconciliation? Is a judgment that leads to a common world, leads to a polis. It is the judgment that in the face of a wrong or evil that threatens to dissolve the common world. I mean, the obvious example, right, is the Holocaust, or Eichmann, or Heidegger. And the essay is sort of broken up into 3 judgments, right? There's the judgment of Heidegger, the judgment of Eichmann, and the judgment of the Holocaust. And what I'm suggesting is that reconciliation is that when the world is threatened with dissolution by a great wrong, you are faced with a decision, a choice. You can either decide to love the world, amor mundi, with the evil in it, and say, I can affirm the world, I can reconcile myself to the world, and say, even though this evil is terrible, the world is better even with it in it than if it were not. Or you can decide to say, this evil is so awful that the world is not better with the evil in it, and I cannot reconcile myself to it. And the two judgments, or the three judgments, I think, that I talk about in different essays of her that I've written on this, are her judgment of Heidegger, her judgment of Eichmann, and the judgment of the Holocaust. It's not an accident that she writes this. There's like 30 sections on reconciliation all through the Denktag book. They go from beginning to end. It's also interesting that the first and the last ones are about Heidegger. The Denk book opens on June 1950, 3 months after she gets back from visiting Heidegger and working for the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Committee in Germany, and a week after she receives a letter from Heidegger with a copy of Hölderlin's poem Reif sind, which she has asked for. And if you reconstruct their letters, what you realize, most of her letters to him have been burned, but you can reconstruct what we have, you get a story, right? The story is that she goes, you all know the story, she visits Heidegger, they go for a walk in the Black Forest, and they talk about language, revenge, and reconciliation. And Heidegger says to her, I've been thinking about what you said about reconciliation. It's very rich. I'm not sure I agree with it, but you asked me to send you the poem by Hölderlin on reconciliation. Here it is, and it's this poem, Reif sind. And the opening line that the burden on our shoulder sits on our shoulders is a indirect citation of the Hölderlin poem Reif sind. So the whole thing begins with this conversation, which I argue, I speculate, and I think I'm on good grounds, about the question of reconciliation / forgiveness against Heidegger. And what she says is we can't worry about guilt in the person. This is what Thomas was talking about the last session. We have to separate the wrong from the person and put it in the world. And I think Arendt's judgment is the world is better in it with Heidegger and all the things that he did that were wrong in it. On the other hand, someone like Eichmann, her judgment at the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem is clearly, to what I take to be, an example of what she calls non-reconciliation. I think it was Thomas, it might have been Tal, who gave the line, which is to me the most important line in that section, about the unbarmherzliches Grenze der Versöhnung, the merciless boundary of reconciliation. And what she says is, there are things that you simply can't reconcile with. And when you encounter one of those, you must erase it from the world. You must say, this should not be. And the language at the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? It would be better that you had not existed. Although she doesn't use the word reconciliation or non-reconciliation, is to me a clear judgment on her part of non-reconciliation. And so, overarching, right, what I'm trying to suggest is that reconciliation is for her the judgment we face. And one last thing I want to say, I'm going to tie it together, because I've only done now the first and the last section. There's 7 in between. But a lot of them are about Hegel and Heidegger. And Hegel is the touchstone for reconciliation. So any of you who've read a lot of Hegel know that Versöhnung is a key word in Hegelian corpus. And the key, and whenever Arendt writes about reconciliation in every one of her published texts except on revolution. And we could argue about Origins, which is before this. But all the others, it's there, and in many of her essays. And in Between Past and Future, in the preface, she writes that the trouble, that for Hegel, the task of the mind is to reconcile with reality and to be at peace with the world. And Arendt calls this risible, right? Awful, because we shouldn't reconcile with the world. We live in a world that there's evil in. And she opposes the Hegelian reconciliation project. But then she says this, which she repeats in countless places in her work. The trouble is that if the mind is unable to bring peace and to induce reconciliation, if reconciliation doesn't work, it finds itself immediately engaged in a kind of warfare. And this is how we understand the gap between past and future, the battlefield, as she calls it, das Schlachtfeld. What for Arendt, in the end, the goal of her thought, what she calls thinking without banisters, is to reconcile ourselves to the irreconcilability of the world, and to love a world in which we need to, at all times, be engaged in the battle to understand and make judgments in a world in which there is no possibility of the rationalization of the is in the Hegelian sense. And so this is a very short attempt to give a flavor of what's in the essay, but I think reconciliation, which is in all of her work, most of her works, but is never a major theme, is, I think, one of the two major themes of the Denktagebuch. And it's, in a sense, the back story to a lot of her thinking on judgment, on politics, and the attempt to live in a world after the break of tradition.